kinanthropometry or anthropometrics. Okay, so what do you know about anthropometrics?
It's basically the study of human body size, human measurements.
Exactly, yeah. So it's just measuring different ways to measure the human body. And kinanthropometry is really just the marriage between those measurements of the human body and how does that affect or influence movement or performance. So that's what we'll talk about today. My background is as a sports dietitian. We're not going to really talk too much, or at least I'm not going to talk too much about the nutrition and food piece of things, but more so on this tool that I use in my assessment that helps me work with athletes and helps me to help them identify what are the best goals for themselves, where are they going to perform the best at, and at what point does the structure of my body start to become a risk for injury, and how can we mitigate some of that. So as I mentioned, my name's Noel Barrilleaux is how you pronounce that long last name. And I'm a performance dietitian at EXOS. I'm also a board certified sports dietitian. I'm registered, licensed in Texas. Instagram handles are up there. EXOS Sports is our company one. And then I also do some private consulting on the side for a company called Nutrition Discovered, which is ironically just down the street here, and I didn't even really know that we were here. So that's a little bit about me. The official definition of kinanthropometry is the study of size, shape, proportion, maturation, and gross function in order to understand growth, exercise, performance, and nutrition. So, in other words, how does the structure of the body affect function? And we know that it does, right? Because you have two largely different species up on the board here. And how does the shape and structure and weight and size and distribution of those limbs and body structures influence what makes a cheetah do what a cheetah does really good at, and what makes an elephant do what an elephant is really good at? In my role at EXOS, I work probably 90% with football players, and so I'm trying to look at these variables with football players. And as you know, there's not one body size and body shape that works best for football players, right? They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but what we can start to do, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is look at position-specific norms and distributions, and essentially that's what we're trying to do here is gather data measuring these athletes and creating distributions on specific characteristics and traits that they have that might make them an outlier in one or another aspect that could potentially be a performance enhancing aspect. Again, we see a lot of different shapes and sizes in the world of sports, right? So there's not one type of body that makes you a phenomenal athlete. You could be itty bitty Tara Lipinski here, about 100 pounds, 5 foot, I don't know, maybe nothing, and you could be the top at your sport. Or you could be one of these athletes up here who are a lot larger, a lot more mass. And so the body can be adapted to the sport either through training, but then also, as you all know, a lot of what makes someone phenomenal and excel at a certain sport is not just training and skill development and athleticism, right? You can only train to a certain degree, but also you have to fall into the sport that your body is best designed for. And there are actually countries around the world like Australia, Russia, China that implement certain kinanthropometric measurements in kids, and from those measurements they can identify certain outliers, like certain athletes that have a really large wingspan, or certain athletes that have a really large foot compared to what the means of that population might be, and what types of sports might you be good at based on those traits, and how can we kind of funnel you into those sports. So I see a lot of this in my work, especially when I work with parents, with coaches. Sometimes, I mean, even just ourselves, we think if I train hard enough, if I start my kid out young enough, they're going to be the next Michael Jordan, right? And it's great to feel that way, and obviously we want to encourage our kids, but at some point, Mother Nature plays a role as well. And there are certain attributes that you have to have in order to be a great basketball player that someone like me, that looks like me, might just not have. And I'm actually a really great example of this. I should have picked figure skating or gymnastics. I fell into volleyball. Not the best choice for my body structure, and as you can imagine, I did not go on to be a world-class Olympic athlete in volleyball. So traditional methods for measuring body composition, this is a big part of what we do in nutrition, as I'm sure you all know, and maybe perhaps in your practice as well. There's different ways, of course, we can weigh yourself through the scale. There's the bod pod, skin fold calipers, underwater weighing, the InBodies, which are relatively new, and then at EXOS we also use DEXA scans as well. For the most part, this is a one compartment model. It just tells you weight, that's one variable. These four in the middle, those are all two compartments. They tell you body fat and then fat-free mass. But we don't really know of that fat-free mass, what percentage of it is lean tissue, muscle tissue, what percentage is water, what percentage is bone, what percentage is skin. The DEXA scan gives us a three-compartment model where we can tell fat mass, fat-free mass, but then also bone mass as well. So it's a little bit more in-depth, but the tools that I'm starting to use now actually produce a 5-compartment model, which is really, really interesting, and it gives us just a richer, more in-depth layer of analysis that we can take to our athletes and really start to get pretty granular in terms of what we can recommend and what's the right goal for you in terms of your body fat and body composition. So how we do this is we use some different tools. Do we have any Dexter fans in the, no one's watched Dexter?
I tried not to finish it because I started it.
So Dexter has this little kit that he opens up. He's a serial killer that kills other serial killers. And he has this little kit that he opens up, but they're knives. I do not have knives in here, but I have all sorts of other scary tools. So we use different tools to essentially measure the skeletal frame, so how wide are your shoulders, how wide are your torso, how wide is your, try to do this, how wide is your depth of your chest from here to here. We use other tools to measure your femur, the breadth of your femur, your elbow, your wrist. So we use some different tools like that. We use and that gives us the bone breadth, which can tell us what the frame of the skeleton is. We use circumference measures, waist, hip, thigh, calf, arm. So we can get some girth measurements, which will tell us the circumferential measure of each of those different areas, and then we can calculate muscle mass from that. Skin folds, which I'm sure all y'all are probably familiar with, the little pinchers. We can use those to pinch for body fat, but then also for skin mass. I also take sitting height, so sitting height, standing height, wingspan, all sorts of different measures. And we get these 5 different compartments. So we can get the skeletal mass. The girths give us muscle mass, so it's not just lean mass, but specifically muscle mass. Skin folds give us our fat tissue mass, and then also our skin. And then residual mass is kind of everything else that kind of lives inside this torso. I have a whole nother, we can go down a whole nother rabbit hole, but I won't for today's purpose just because I only have a limited amount of time. But we can talk if you guys want any more information about how we do that, the calculations and the studies that kind of gave birth to that method. Just email me afterwards, I'll give you my information. Okay, so applications of this tool. One, we can use it for talent selection. So we see this with teams when they take certain measurements. If I have 2 athletes that play the same position, same level of skill, talent, athleticism, we can then say, well, are they equal? Maybe, maybe not, but the one who has the skill, talent, everything else, but they have the right body structure for that position is always going to be a little bit more desirable. And so we can look at that because their body is designed to perform the tasks of that given position or job. So we can use it for talent selection, and countries are doing this all over the world with Olympic sports. We can use it for goal setting. This is a big part of what I do with athletes because sometimes they sit down with you and they have these goals, or coaches will send me athletes that are in high school and they just say, so-and-so needs to put on 40 pounds this off season, and they throw these arbitrary numbers out there without any kind of understanding of 1, is it physiologically possible? 2, if it was possible, is it recommended? Is it a good thing? Is it healthy? Would we necessarily want to? We can also use some of those measurements to determine maturation, peak height velocity, which can then help us inform certain training decisions, whether a child is before or after that peak height velocity. As I mentioned before, my primary client are football players, so I'm collecting a lot of data on football players specifically and just looking at the different positions and what are the different norms. And there's a specific variable that I'll kind of zero in on that we're really looking at that seems to be highly correlated with injury risk and then performance outcomes. But if you've noticed, over the years, professional football players have gotten quite large. So what was this? Anyone know Alan Page? Back in like the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, your average football player was probably around 200 pounds. Now the smallest players in the league are around 200 pounds. Our defensive tackle, these two players both played defensive tackle. Again, back in the 60s, 245 was a D tackle. Today, 335 is your average D tackle in the league. So they've gotten very large. And at some point, we have to ask ourselves, how big is too big? Like, is bigger necessarily better? And that's what we're really specifically looking at with some of these measurements is how much muscle and how much mass is your skeleton truly capable of carrying without compromising performance, without increasing your risk of getting injured. And we're creating these distributions for each position. The variable that we're really most interested in, like I said before, is we're looking at those 5 different compartments. So we can specifically look at muscle mass relative to bone structure. So if we know the weight of your skeleton, how much muscle is that skeleton equipped to carry? And we call that a muscle to bone ratio. Essentially, if I have 10 pounds of skeleton, how many, what's the distribution of muscle what's the ratio of muscle compared to that 10 pounds? So if I have 30 pounds of muscle, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. And there seems to be this optimal sweet spot where we're seeing most football players fall. And there's different ranges for different sports too, but I'm going to focus on football just because that's my bread and butter. But we see a muscle to bone ratio of about 4.5 being kind of right in the middle, and then the low end of that range, we're seeing about 3.5 in some of the smaller players, and then the ceiling tends to be around 5.5. In African American football players, which are the majority of them, we can see them as high as 5.9, so their skeletons tend to carry a higher amount. But above that, what seems to be the trend, and we're looking at this, is higher potential for injury, and then also just hindrance to performance. Does anyone know what this picture is? Or can you guess? Kind of hard to tell. Yes, it's an elevator shaft. So it's like you're looking down on an elevator, and these are the cables that are holding it. So what do you notice every time you walk into an elevator? There's a little sign on there, right? There's some buttons. There's your emergency button, right? But then there's a sign that says, what is the maximum capacity of that elevator? Why does an elevator have a maximum capacity? It's because these... So what? Somebody died, but why did they die? Because this cable is only strong enough to hold a certain amount of weight, and if we put too much weight in that elevator, we put too much tension on that cable. And so with your musculature, if you have too much muscle and it's too heavy, you're putting too much tension on that tendon, and there's going to be some tendon issues and soft tissue issues as well. And so those are some of the trends that we're really looking at. I wanted to just give you a case study of an example of an athlete, or a couple examples of athletes that I've done these measures. So I've done, all these different measures, the mass, the stature, the wingspan, everything, the bone breadths, the girths, the skin folds, and then we get that 5-way fractionation model. And so again, going down to this guy, this was a linebacker that I measured who is declaring, he's a college linebacker declaring for the 2025 draft. And so his agent sends him to me, and his mass was 90 kilos. What was that in pounds? Someone that's better at math than me. Okay, yeah, so 198. So do we have anyone here that follows football or plays football? No? Okay. Okay, so 198-pound linebacker is very, very small. So your average linebacker in the league is going to be around 225 to 235. So this agent sends this guy to us and says, okay, his goal is he needs to put on 20 pounds, and he wants to go declare for the 2025 draft. And my job then at that point, again, you have an agent who has no background, who doesn't understand like realistic goals, things like that. And so now my job is to go and assess this person and figure out, like, is this doable? Is it not doable? Is it safe to do that? What does it look like if it is? And what's the time frame that that's going to take? And so what we did was we went and we collected all the measurements and we ran some numbers and we calculated that his muscle to bone ratio was lots of data, 5.09. So at 198 pounds as linebacker, he's already at a very high muscle to bone ratio, meaning that his bone structure is already carrying a large amount of muscle relative to how big his skeleton is. So then it's like, well, can we put that mass on? So I ran a couple other calculations. The first one kind of erring on the side of being a little bit more conservative. So what can we potentially get him up to a 5.5? And what does that look like? Assuming that some of that weight's going to be a little bit of fat gain, how much muscle can he get to? And what does that translate into his ideal body weight? And it came out to about 212. So 212 is a conservative estimate. That would be a safe. Now, if we push that limit all the way up to 5.9 muscle to bone ratio, again, assuming that he's going to add a little bit of body fat with that, we can go all the way up to 221. So then, in my final report to the agent, what I determined was situation one, conservative, he could weigh with around 212. He can get up to 221, but that's the absolute ceiling on his current skeleton. And here's what that time frame is going to take. So on average, a normal, healthy adult male can expect to gain 1 to 2 pounds of muscle per month if they do everything right. So eat right, hydrate, sleep right, avoid alcohol, all the things, right? Optimize your training, optimize your recovery nutrition. If they're doing everything right, they can gain 1 to 2 pounds per month. So I told the agent, if he does everything right, he can potentially add 10 pounds of muscle over the next 5 to 10 months if he wants to declare for 2024, or if he wants to give himself more time and declare for 2025, it'll take him 9 to 19 months. Okay, if he does everything right. He's a college kid. He doesn't eat breakfast because I don't like eating breakfast in the morning. He eats McDonald's for lunch. He eats Chick-fil-A for dinner. He snacks on candy bars and fruit snacks. So now the conversation shifts to, yes, it's doable. Here's how long, here's the time frame that we're looking at, and here's what it's going to take to get there. If he is not willing to make those changes and to be consistent over the next 9 to 19 months, we might be needing to have a different conversation about, should we market him as a strong safety instead? And I had another athlete just this last year in the NFL Combine who was around similar dimensions, came in at 190, 198, 205. They're actually very similar structurally, both linebackers, and the criticism that he was getting from every scout was, you're too small, you're an undersized linebacker. We got him up to 216, but he was still too small, and it was a lot of fat too. He didn't slow down a lot, but I don't think he reached his true potential. I think he could have run a faster 40 if we hadn't put on that fat. So then it's like, did we do him a disservice by pushing the linebacker narrative when maybe we should have said, hey, his structure, he's built more like a safety. Like, let's market him as a strong safety, or let's see if he can be coached into that position, and now we can increase his draft stock. So I am really geeked out by this kind of stuff and how I assess athletes and kind of help navigate that sometimes uncomfortable conversation. But I realize it's probably kind of a boring topic for some of y'all. Like I said, we're not talking too much about the nutrition piece, but then that's kind of chapter 2 of this, is taking this, finding out what the realistic goal is and what's healthy and what's normal, but then implementing, strategies and interventions to help get them to that goal is kind of what comes next. And that's the food piece, right? So, any questions? Or if we had more time, I brought my kit and I was going to demo on some poor victim if they wanted to, but Unfortunately, I have to actually get out of here today, but I can stick around for a few questions if anyone has questions. Yes?
I had no idea this existed as a
Yes.
thing. It's really cool, actually.
Yeah.
And,
I am super geeked out about it.
yeah.
They're doing all of these measurements at the combine, and they're giving them to teams so that when teams are trying to decide between players, like, they can look at talent, they can look at tape, and they can select, like, okay, well, these guys are pretty similar talent-wise, tape-wise, performance-wise, but then, like, we can present them with measurements, and they can say, okay, look, I'm looking at a defensive end. Player one, they're both fantastic. Player one has a wingspan that's 15 centimeters taller than his height. I want that guy. You know, so it's things like that that we're looking at for talent selection, and so yeah, it's interesting. And then we're also trying to catch those measurements earlier so that we can have those conversations with the players and the athletes as far as like, hey, realistically, like, you're going to be called an undersized whatever, or you're just not the right body structure for this. Let's change our strategy so that we can still increase your draft stock and get you drafted.
So is there like a direct, because here at Greater Than we deal a lot with pain and injury.
Yes.
Is there a direct correlation between some of these numbers and percentages of muscle to bone and all that with injuries?
There's no studies that exist right now, but that's the data that we're collecting, and that we have strength coaches and dietitians in the league who are collecting this data, and we're publishing it. And so once that comes out, like, our hypothesis kind of goes back to that elevator view, right? Like, this is the hypothesis, is that if we put too much muscle on this guy, it puts too much strain on the tendons and the connective tissues. And what they're seeing in the data that they're collecting is that there seems to be a lot of anecdotal evidence, like, these guys are either not getting, we see it when we test 40s, like, these guys just aren't getting fast. And sometimes it's a biomechanical issue, sometimes it's a PT issue that they need to go work out. Sometimes, you know, there's all sorts of reasons for it, but sometimes it's like, this dude's just got too much muscle on. Let's see what happens if we bring that muscle down. And what I'm hearing from other dietitians in the league is that they're seeing like a very strong correlation, just anecdotally, between injuries and then guys just having like really high muscle to bone. And then once we get them down a little bit lighter, they actually feel better, they perform better, they're lighter, they're quicker, more agile, and then the tissues aren't as strained and they seem to have less injuries. So we won't know for sure, like, again, it's not published at this point, but that's what we're working on, collecting that information. And then hopefully we'll have a study published, and then we can see, you know, does this confirm or refute that hypothesis?
So obviously there's a ton of different factors
Yeah.
that go into somebody being
Yes.
injured, but I worked on multiple NFL players, some of them retired, and just their injury rates are crazy.
Yes.
And to have some type of data that
They've
shows
gone
that
up
if you
with
do
this.
these things, then you'll be less prone to getting injured, that would be huge. So
Yes.
it's very cool.
That's what we're hoping to uncover. Yes.
Okay, so I'm a musician, and I'm sitting here thinking about how we like already do all of this in music, where like, did anyone play an instrument in elementary school where you like try all the instruments and then you end up playing one? So like, I was tiny. I never would have picked tuba because I wouldn't have been able to walk
Yeah.
around in marching band with the tuba. As a singer, my vocal folds are the size that they are. I can't be a bass. You know,
Yeah.
like, I can't sing bass. And this is stuff that's implemented in schools, and so the question is, do you see this becoming something where, like, instead of these kids just saying, I want to play soccer because my friend plays soccer,
Yeah.
like, you do something like this where you try it out, you see how it works, you look at their body.
Yes.
And, like, I just see competitive athletics being insane if you start doing that when you,
Yes.
I guess it's a little bit different because there's a lot more growth that needs to happen first.
Yeah, early specialization is not wise for kids unless you see things that are like really like glaring outliers, things like with the skeleton more so than anything.
Right.
You know, like either, you know, kids that are abnormally tall or abnormally compact or abnormally long wingspans, feet, hands, that kind of thing. But yeah, here in Texas, there is a very strong drive for like youth sports and youth athletics and like starting kids out super early and specializing them super, super young. And sometimes, and I've seen this too when I've had high school coaches bring players to me, you know, and they were always like the big chubby kid growing up. They hit their peak height velocity very young, so they were always this big, like kind of overweight kid, and then as they got older, they turned into a beanpole. But they specialized that kid as an offensive lineman since he was this big. So now you look at him and you're like, you look like a quarterback or a tight end. And he can't play either of those positions because the only thing he's ever played is O-line. And now coach is saying, well, he only weighs 186 pounds and he needs to get up to 260 by next season. And I'm like, doing my little calculations, you know, and I'm like, ain't gonna happen. Yeah, and you know, and then even the parents are coming and saying, well, he needs to get up to 260 by next August, but it needs to be healthy weight. It can't be just fat weight. And so then now I have objective data to give them and present them and say, like, that's not possible. Because sometimes just saying that's not possible, like, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to believe that. So to answer your question, roundabout answer, I don't know in this country. I think in the US we're kind of behind on this stuff. I think a lot of other countries like Argentina, Australia, China, Russia, like I had mentioned, they're doing this already in kids and measuring and trying to identify those outliers. And they've done it with like certain Olympic sports too, where they'll have like, you know, girls in gymnastics, and they're like, no, you can't do gymnastics anymore, you're a pole vaulter, because they do these measurements, and like in some of those countries, you don't really have a choice to say, no, I want to play gymnastics, you know, I don't want to be a pole vaulter. They just say, you're going to go be a pole vaulter. And then they go on to be a gold medal pole vaulter because they've identified these certain physical attributes that set someone up for success. So yes, you can train, yes, you can develop your skill level, but only to a certain point, right? At the end of the day, some of the best athletes in the world have trained their skill level to the maximum, but then they've also just fallen into a sport or selected a sport that was just perfect for their body. So I hope that we do more of that in schools, just not necessarily to crush anyone's dreams, but just to be like, hey, you've got really big feet like flippers, you might be good at swimming, have you ever considered swimming? And kind of